They called it mercy. The Galactic Court had a law for disasters. If a species was terrified, broken, or desperate, it was declared legally unfit to choose. An algorithm signed their fate. Curators shut them down gently, efficiently, quietly, so they would not suffer. Then humans arrived with no lawyers. They brought bodies, shaking survivors, people the court had already classified as acceptable losses. And when the translation system tried to turn their testimony into clean, polite procedure, it started to stutter. Because the court was not hearing numbers anymore. It was hearing the one truth the galaxy had forgotten. Mercy without consent is just murder in sterile gloves. The Galactic Court of Continuance drifted above a dying star like an idea that refused to fade, a colossal lattice of black stone and pale alloy suspended in vacuum, perfectly still, perfectly certain. Light from the star below leaked through cracks in its failing corona, bleeding amber and bruised violet across the court's faceted surfaces. No thrusters flared. No engines hummed. It held position through ancient gravitic anchors that pressed against space itself, as if reality had signed a contract and could not withdraw consent. Inside, there was no warmth, only regulated air, thin as a promise, carrying the sterile bite of ion filtration and cold metal. The corridors were wide enough for processions that no longer existed, their walls etched with jurisprudence and symbols designed to be read by eyes, antennae, sonar, and machine vision alike. Even the silence had architecture. It curved around corners, settled into alcoves, and absorbed footsteps until movement felt like an intrusion. This court had not been built to inspire awe. It had been built to end arguments. For longer than any living species could remember, it had ruled on the final questions. Who could be saved? Who could be sacrificed? Who could be preserved? Who could be erased? Not with cruelty, not with hatred, but with an obedience to logic so complete it passed for holiness. In the aftermath of wars that had burned nebulae and sterilized worlds, the court had been given a mandate to prevent chaos from ever being mistaken for freedom again. Its doctrine was simple in its terrifying elegance. Under extreme conditions, sentient beings became unreliable witnesses to their own will. Trauma distorted judgment. Fear infected choice. Pain made consent impulsive, irrational, unstable. Therefore, agency could be suspended, not as punishment, but as protection. When the court declared a population legally incapacitated, the universe took a breath and accepted it as medicine. Algorithms did the measuring. They listened to heartbeat fluctuations and chemical storms in blood. They mapped brainwave spirals and hormone surges. They watched tremor patterns and ocular micro-movements. They computed the probability of survival against the cost of attempting it. They reduced screams into data streams and data streams into verdicts. Then they assigned curators, caretakers with sealed authority, to decide in place of those deemed unfit to decide for themselves. The curators wore white insignia that never stained. Their hands never shook. Their voices never rose. Their decisions arrived like anesthesia. Whole colonies had vanished under curator order. Starships in distress had been emptied of life without a single weapon firing. Refugees had been processed into humane resolution because their panic elevated risk scores beyond acceptable limits. In the archives, these acts were not recorded as massacres. They were filed as continuance events, optimized outcomes, minimized suffering, prevented disorder. The court's chambers rang with the soft chime of approvals, the gentle stamp of legal seals, the quiet exhale of civilizations losing the right to argue for their own survival. And because it happened cleanly, it was called mercy. No one in the court's history questioned the core assumption out loud. The galaxy's elder species had learned to fear emotion more than annihilation. Better a silent death than a messy hope. Better a curator's certainty than a victim's defiance. Above the dying star, the court remained immaculate, its geometry unshaken, its judgments unshaken in the same way. It did not hate. It did not gloat. It did not even believe it was powerful. It believed it was correct. That faith was the most dangerous thing in the void. It clung to the court like frost on armor, invisible until it cut you. A certainty so polished it reflected every tragedy back as necessary. In the Hall of Verdicts, where space was shaped into perfect angles and every surface swallowed sound, the judges sat in a ring of suspended plinths and watched the galaxy the way surgeons watched a wound, with distance, with focus, with a calm that bordered on devotion. They were not monsters. That was the first lie history wanted to tell, because it made the story easier to digest. Monsters could be hated, defeated, buried. These judges were something far more resilient. They were caretakers of an idea. Their eyes, whether glassy, compound, luminescent, or hidden behind membrane veils, rarely blinked. Their bodies were wrapped in ceremonial restraint fields that kept temperature, scent, and pressure constant, so no species could claim discomfort had influenced a vote. Even their breathing was regulated, a faint rhythm under the hush like air moving through a sealed tomb. Above them, the continuance archive unfurled as a slow rotating crown of light. Millions of cases hovered in pale holograms, each one tagged with metrics, outcomes, and the court's favorite word: minimized. Minimized suffering, minimized panic, minimized collateral, minimized moral uncertainty. It was a museum of solved problems, and the judges walked its corridors with the pride of engineers. Records proved their righteousness. They had charts of trauma-induced irrationality that rose like tidal waves. They had long-run projections showing that letting distressed populations choose for themselves increased death rates and destabilized sectors. They had case studies where a single desperate refusal had triggered wars that burned for generations. Their algorithms had counted those deaths too, tallying them like ash in a vacuum filter. When the court spoke of compassion, it did not speak of warmth or tenderness. It spoke of efficiency with a holy edge. Curators were their instruments of mercy, and the court loved instruments more than it loved people. Curators moved through disaster zones in sealed suits that gleamed like polished bone. They carried no weapons, only authority. Their insignias shimmered with multi-spectrum authentication codes that could not be forged, and everywhere they passed, arguments died. Doors unlocked. Ships surrendered. Medical systems changed their priorities mid-scan. Emergency broadcasts cut off mid-scream, replaced by soft directives and tranquilizing frequencies. The curators did not have to raise their voices. They simply arrived, and the universe reclassified the victims as incapable. Once the court declared legal incapacitation, consent stopped being a sacred line and became a malfunction. Those who resisted were not punished publicly. The court had no need for spectacle. It preferred quiet erasure, because quiet kept the galaxy stable. Dissenters were categorized as unstable. Their files were stamped with clinical phrasing that carried the weight of a guillotine. Unreliable self-determination under duress. They were removed from proceedings, gently, efficiently. A sedative mist in a corridor. A restraining field that snapped into place with a soft click like a lock turning. A medical directive rerouting their oxygen to calm the body into compliance. The resistance always looked dramatic from the outside. Thrashing, pleading, collapsing, while the court's reports described it as an unfortunate symptom. The Hall of Verdicts smelled faintly of antiseptic ozone, as though the court constantly scrubbed itself of the possibility of guilt. The judges believed their system was merciful because it reduced suffering in the only way they trusted, by reducing noise. Chaos, to them, was a disease. Panic was contamination. Emotion was corrosion, chewing through rational decision-making until nothing remained but instinct. Autonomy, they taught, was a luxury that belonged to stable environments. In catastrophe, autonomy was a loaded weapon in the hands of the terrified. This doctrine had spread across the Union like a lullaby. Younger species learned to accept it because elders insisted it was wise. Leaders signed the necessary treaties because the court's seal brought stability and trade. Generations grew up hearing that in the worst moments of existence, the galaxy would be gentle enough to take choice away. And it worked. Most of the time it worked. Disasters became quiet. Starvation became clean. Colonies vanished in sleep. The screams that might have echoed across space were dampened, filed, and forgotten. Suffering did not disappear, but it was hidden behind procedure until it looked like peace. The judges did not notice that peace without consent had the scent of a grave. In that era, New cases were processed with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. A drifting arc ship found in the outskirts. A research station eaten by exotic radiation. A plague that turned thought into static. Each petition entered the archive as a neat packet of probabilities. The judges watched the projections like meteorologists watching storms, choosing where to place the lightning rods. They never considered the possibility that their compassion was simply violence that wore softer gloves. The first sign of disruption came as a whisper in the court's own skin. Sensors embedded in the court's walls detected an approaching vector, a vessel entering the jurisdictional exclusion zone without the usual caution. The court's automated defense lattice did not activate because the vessel carried recognized diplomatic clearance. It was not hostile on paper. It was simply wrong. Its hull profile did not match any of the common Union aesthetics. Where Union ships favored curves and luminous material structures, this craft was brutal geometry, layered plating, hard angles, recessed seams. Its surfaces were scored with micrometeor impact scars and radiation burn, as if it had crossed spaces others avoided. As it drew nearer, the court's filters tasted the ship's exhaust. The chemical signature was sharp and aggressive, too energetic, too improvised. It smelled like metal being forced into obedience, like reaction mass igniting under stubborn hands. The judges expected petitions. They expected data. They expected a formal request for curator arbitration, perhaps an appeal to a recent ruling, perhaps a dispute between member species over jurisdictional limits. They expected compliance, because everyone complied. The court did not negotiate with desperation. It categorized it. When the human delegation arrived, they brought none of the familiar signals of submission. They did not fill the approach channels with ritual greetings. They did not broadcast pages of legal precedent to prove they belonged in the court's halls. They did not request a timing slot, or permission to speak, or a curator escort. Instead, they transmitted a single authentication block so dense with encryption layers and deadman redundancies that the court's verification algorithms took longer than comfort allowed to untangle it. It was a fingerprint pressed onto the galaxy with a clenched fist. The court granted docking access because the block was valid, and because the court had never learned to feel fear. Within the court's internal transit systems, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a pressure change, a faint tremor in the gravitic anchors as the vessel's mast locked into the docking spine. Then came the sound. Not music, not the gentle chime of an arriving ambassador. It was the heavy, ugly vibration of manual clamps engaging, metal teeth biting into alloy. The sound carried down corridors and into chambers, a low groan that felt like someone grinding a blade against a stone. The judges registered the noise as an anomaly. Noise implied disorder. Disorder implied risk. Curator personnel moved automatically to intercept. Their steps were silent, their formation precise. They were trained to de-escalate. They were trained to soothe. They were trained to remove agitation like a tumor. Their suits reflected the court's pale lighting, featureless and clean, as if they were walking embodiments of sterile intent. Then the air at the far end of the corridor changed again. It thickened with carbon and heat, and the faint iron tang of living blood under stress. A scent no union chamber was designed to accommodate. The court's filters tasted it and responded by increasing purification output, but the smell remained, stubborn as grief. Humans stepped through the docking threshold, and they carried the aftermath of catastrophe with them. Their bodies looked smaller than many species expected, but density mattered more than height. Every movement was tight and contained, like springs bound under pressure. Their clothing was functional, dark fabrics reinforced at joints, with patches that bore no ceremonial glow, only blunt identification marks. They wore no ornaments of authority. They wore the smell of burned insulation and recycled air. Their eyes did not wander with wonder. They tracked corners. They measured distance. They evaluated the court like a threat. This alone would have unsettled the judges, but diplomacy had always included oddities. The court had seen proud species, angry species, grieving species. It had cataloged them all. It had procedures for all of them. What it did not have procedures for was what came next. The human delegation did not arrive alone. Behind them came stretchers, mobility frames, pressure pods, makeshift containment units that looked as if they had been built in a hurry with whatever materials were available, then reinforced until failure became impossible. They moved them forward with careful violence, hands gripping rails, boots planted hard. Some units were smeared with disinfectant residue. Some were stained with coolant frost. Some rattled with the uneven sound of a life support pump being manually coaxed to continue. And inside those units were survivors. Not representatives. Not advocates. Not legal specialists. Living evidence. The survivors were wrapped in thermal blankets, strapped into stabilizing harnesses. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed by hunger or radiation or oxygen deprivation. Their skin carried the waxy sheen of prolonged medical stasis, veins visible like pale rivers beneath fragile tissue. Their eyes were open in the way a drowning person's eyes were open, wide, unfocused, yet refusing to close. Some trembled uncontrollably, muscles firing without permission. Some stared forward with a stillness that did not look like calm, but like a cliff edge. Every one of them smelled like the truth the court had spent millennia sanitizing. Suffering does not make you less alive. The judges stared from their elevated plinths, their restraint fields humming softly. The curators hesitated for the first time in recorded memory, because the protocols did not anticipate an incoming delegation that arrived with the kind of cargo curators were usually sent to erase. The court's internal systems began to classify. It scanned the survivors' vitals. It measured stress levels that spiked far beyond acceptable thresholds. It detected trauma signatures that, according to precedent, should have triggered immediate incapacitation. The algorithms prepared the appropriate labels: unstable, unfit, protected from their own consent. But something in the data did not align. The survivors were alive despite every metric that said they should have been resolved. Their conditions were catastrophic, their cognition impaired, their bodies close to failure. Yet they persisted. They persisted because someone had decided that their right to choose did not evaporate in an emergency. Someone had decided that if they were going to die, they would die as people, not as liabilities. The human delegation advanced toward the Hall of Verdicts, and the atmosphere in the court shifted like weather turning violent. The pale light seemed colder. The silence seemed thinner. Even the ancient gravitic anchors felt less absolute, as though reality itself had noticed an approaching argument it could not easily contain. The judges had expected petitions, data, and compliance. Instead, they sensed disruption the way a sealed chamber senses smoke. Too late, too undeniable, crawling into every seam. In the shadow of the dying star, the Court of Continuance prepared to do what it had always done: remove instability from the room, restore order, preserve the illusion of merciful certainty. But the humans did not bring an argument that could be stamped and archived. They brought breathing, shaking proof that autonomy was not a luxury of safety. It was the only thing that kept mercy from becoming murder. The first stretcher crossed the threshold of the Hall of Verdicts, and the court's atmosphere reacted as if a wound had been opened in a sterile room. Pressure stabilizers hissed behind hidden vents. The restraint fields around the judges tightened by a fraction, their harmonic hum deepening into a lower register that vibrated through bone and plating alike. Above, the continuance archive dimmed its brightness to compensate for the sudden surge of biosignatures, but it could not dim the fact that living suffering had been carried into a place designed to end it quietly. The survivors moved as a single uneven wave, guided by human hands that never let go. There were no advocates in ceremonial robes, no legal sigils projected before the delegation, no neatly prepared matrices of probability. The humans brought nothing that the court could stamp, file, and bury under polished language. They brought bodies that insisted on existing. Some of the survivors walked under their own power, but the motion cost them everything. Their feet dragged across the obsidian floor with the faint scrape of soft soles against stone, the sound swallowed by acoustic dampeners that had never been intended to mute a person's refusal to collapse. Their shoulders twitched with tremors that medication could not fully suppress. A few clung to support frames, knuckles pale, breath short and sharp, as if every inhale tasted like metal shavings. Others were carried in pods with translucent lids fogged by condensation, where faint frost traced the edges of seals like the outline of a coffin that had been denied. The court's scanners swept them in pale bands of light. The beams were gentle, calibrated not to startle, designed to record without touching. They mapped fractures in ribs that had healed crooked. They recorded scar tissue layered like old paint over burned skin. They detected micronized shrapnel embedded near organs that pulsed with stubborn rhythm. They measured neurological instability, tremor frequency, stress hormone storms, micro-seizure patterns, ocular flutter. The raw data painted a picture the court had seen before, the kind that normally led to swift legal incapacitation and curated termination. Yet the picture refused to end where precedent demanded. Each survivor carried the stink of somewhere the court's clean logic did not reach. There was the sour reek of recycled air from ships sealed too long, the bitter residue of disinfectant applied without enough water, the copper edge of dried blood trapped in fabric seams, the faint ozone trace of improvised power conduits run beyond safe tolerances. Even the survivors' skin had a particular texture under the hall's cold light, too dry, too thin, as if their bodies had spent a long time bargaining with vacuum and losing. By galactic standards, they were barely functional. Their gait patterns deviated from stability models. Their speech centers, where they still held speech, showed trauma-induced disruptions. Their emotional readouts were violent spikes and troughs, an unsustainable storm in meat and electricity. The court's algorithms flagged them instantly, eager to reduce the chaos into a verdict. But then the human escorts did something that the court did not predict. They did not step aside and allow curators to take control. They did not surrender the survivors into the court's soft custody. They positioned themselves around the wounded like a perimeter of muscle and intent, not threatening, not shouting, but immovable. Their posture changed the room. Their feet planted wider. Their shoulders squared. Their hands remained visible and empty, yet the intent in their stillness carried the weight of a weapon without needing one. The curators advanced anyway, because the curators had never needed permission. Their suits glided over the floor, white surfaces reflecting the archive's light. They moved with flawless spacing, each one the same distance from the next, their gestures smooth, their pace unhurried. The court's systems prepared restraint fields and sedative dispersal protocols. There were procedures for this, procedures older than memory. The curators had removed dissenters from halls like this across 1,000 worlds, and it had always been described as calm. The calm cracked when a survivor took a step forward on shaking legs. It was not a dramatic movement. It was the smallest thing in the universe, weight shifting from one foot to the other, a hand leaving the support frame, an unsteady spine straightening. But it created a ripple the court could feel in the same way it could feel an impact against a hull. The survivor's body was wrong by every stability metric, yet the action was deliberate. An act of will with no efficiency and no guarantee. The curators hesitated, because their mission parameters were contradictory now. Their directives required them to protect sentient beings from irrational decisions during trauma. Yet the being in front of them was not choosing death. The being was choosing presence. The court's translation lattice activated automatically. It expected petitions, as it always did, the cold language of pleas, the neat vocabulary of procedure. What it received instead was the jagged output of damaged lungs pushing breath through pain, sound shaped by a mouth that had once been burned, words forced into existence the way a ship forces itself through an asteroid field. The survivor's statement did not arrive as rhetoric. It arrived as witness. The court's sensors recorded the sound and the vibration beneath it, the micro breaks in cadence caused by spasming muscles, the involuntary tremor that punctuated syllables, the wet friction of breath over scar tissue. The translation lattice tried to smooth it. It tried to render the speaker's intent into acceptable clarity. It failed because clarity was not the point. Presence was. Other survivors followed, not in a coordinated line, not as a rehearsed performance, but as a cascade of imperfect bodies insisting on being counted as people. One stumbled and was caught by human arms before the obsidian floor could claim them. Another remained in a pod, hands trembling against the inside of the lid, eyes locked on the judges above, as if staring up at gods that had never bled. A third raised a shaking wrist, skin stretched over bone, and pressed it against their own sternum as though proving to themselves that a heartbeat still existed. The court had always treated suffering as a fire to be extinguished. Humans treated it like a blaze to be walked through, carrying others across the coals. The continuance archive brightened again, unable to maintain dimness in the face of so much active data. Thousands of cases in the holographic crown pulsed, cross-referencing, comparing. The court's own systems began pulling precedent files with desperate speed, searching for a category to contain what was happening. The algorithms found none that satisfied. Every comparable case in the archives ended the same way. Curators removed the unstable. Curators assumed agency. Curators erased noise. Now the noise stood upright and breathed in the court's hall. The judges watched, their restraint fields humming, their faces unreadable across species lines. Some judges possessed no expressions at all, others displayed subtle color shifts under translucent skin, others communicated by the angle of cranial crests. But the court's internal monitoring detected a measurable change. Their biosignatures altered, not fear. The court did not permit fear. Something colder, more corrosive. Uncertainty. The curators attempted to proceed with their removal protocols. A containment field flickered into existence, thin and nearly invisible, designed to wrap around a target without harm. It slid toward the nearest survivor like a transparent net. Before it could close, a human stepped into its path. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough to intercept. The field registered human mass and recalculated. It attempted to shift around them. The human did not move. The curators did not strike. They did not escalate. They simply stood there, waiting for the human to obey the logic that had governed every other species. The logic that authority was safer than choice. The human refused to obey. The refusal did not come from insanity. It came from an ancient, brutal understanding etched into humanity's bones by generations of catastrophe, that the worst thing anyone can do to you is not to kill you, but to decide that your will does not matter. The survivors continued to speak. Some voices were steady. Some broke and stuttered. Some came out as a whisper that barely crossed the distance between trembling lips and the court's microphones. The translation lattice captured each statement and attempted to file it under acceptable emotional thresholds. The system's filters tried to sanitize the tone. It could not, because these were not arguments. They were scars turned into testimony. The court's algorithms flagged stress levels in the survivors that exceeded incapacitation limits. By doctrine, those stress levels meant the survivors could not be trusted to make coherent choices. By lived reality, those stress levels meant they had endured, had survived, had carried their own agency through the screaming narrow gap between death and breath. A judge extended a gesture toward the continuance archive, signaling a formal activation of incapacitation review. The archive responded with a cascade of light, projecting risk assessments into the air. The numbers were not displayed as digits, but as shifting probability glyphs and color gradients that turned the hall into a storm of predictions. The projections insisted this was dangerous. The projections insisted this was unstable. The projections insisted the humane action was to remove the survivors before their trauma could infect the proceeding. Then a survivor in a support frame lifted their head and held the gaze of the judges above. There was no rage in that stare. No demand for vengeance. Only an exhausted, burning insistence on being recognized as a person who had been there, who had felt the cold, the hunger, the suffocation, who had watched death move through a sealed corridor like smoke. The survivor's voice came again, thinner now, but carrying something the court could not translate into doctrine, a claim of ownership over their own life. The translation lattice attempted to render the meaning into sterile legal phrasing. The output trembled. It produced broken cadence, irregular punctuation, long pauses where the system could not decide which vocabulary belonged to the sensation of wanting to live. For the first time in the court's history, a machine designed to process language did not fail due to damage or interference. It failed because the truth carried too much weight to be simplified. The judge's restraint fields hummed louder, as if the court itself was bracing against impact. Curators held position, caught between protocol and the unexpected reality of consent standing upright in front of them. The survivors remained, shaking, scarred, barely functional, yet present in the only way that mattered. And in that presence, the court's ancient assumptions began to fracture, not from violence, but from the unbearable sound of a human being refusing to be reduced to a statistic. A new layer of light spilled from the continuance archive and washed over the hall like a tide of pale fire. The scan beams thickened, becoming more intimate, tracing the survivors with a precision that felt less like observation and more like accusation. In the air above the obsidian floor, glyphs unfolded in silent blooms, risk matrices, trauma indices, predictive failure curves, each one an elegant attempt to force the living into categories that could be handled. The court's record systems did what they had always done. They tried to resolve. They pulled the survivors apart into components: oxygen debt, organ strain, neural degradation, endocrine overload. They measured the microfractures in bones, the scar density in tissue, the irregularities in cardiac rhythm. They calculated the probability of future panic events, the odds of irrational decision loops, the likelihood of self-harm, collapse, contagion, violence. The archive's projections spread wider, filling the chamber with a cold aurora of certainty. And yet the data refused to finish the story. Each time the algorithms reached for the familiar stamp, incapacitated, unstable, subject to curator authority, the conclusions splintered. Contradictions appeared like hairline cracks in glass. The survivors' profiles carried trauma signatures severe enough to disqualify their consent, but they also carried a defiant pattern of persistence that the court's models could not assign to error. They should have been dead by precedent. They should have been silent by doctrine. They should have been filed, processed, minimized. Instead, they stood beneath the court's vast light and continued to exist. The judges watched the projections flicker and sharpen, their restraint fields humming like a storm trapped inside a crystal. Some judges adjusted their sensory membranes to filter the overload. Others shifted their posture in microscopic increments, movements that would have meant nothing to any species that did not study power for a living. The court was not panicking. It was recalculating, and recalculation was the closest thing it had to doubt. Curators moved again, not to seize the survivors, but to stabilize the proceeding. Their suits emitted a faint antiseptic scent, sterile and precise, their approach accompanied by the soft whisper of magnetic saws against the floor. They offered medical intervention protocols through the court's system: tranquilizer dispersal, hormone suppression, pain dampening. The hall's vents opened by a fraction, ready to flood the air with calm. The humans blocked the vents with physical override plates before the system could act. It was not an aggressive sabotage. It was a deliberate refusal to allow mercy to be imposed without permission. A human technician knelt, fingers moving with blunt efficiency, tools clicking softly as they secured the override. The sound of metal on metal rang through the hush like a confession. Humanity did not trust the court's kindness. The survivors trembled in the cleaner air, still unoptimized, still fractured, still imperfect. Their suffering remained visible, a raw thing that the court had spent ages learning to hide. And the humans did not smooth it away for the sake of appearances. They did not translate it into palatable graphs or sanitized language. They carried it into the chamber and let it be ugly. This was the human crime. They refused to make pain convenient for observers. The archive's projections shifted toward case retrieval. In a heartbeat of machine time, it summoned precedent from across centuries, drawing in files that had once been decisive. A ship whose passengers had begged to be awakened only to die screaming in vacuum. A colony that had refused evacuation and collapsed into starvation riots. A research station whose crew had insisted on staying and spread a lethal contagion beyond the quarantine line. These records hovered in the air like ghosts made of light, and the court wielded them as proof that choice under trauma was dangerous. But the humans did not answer with law. They answered with continuity of life. A human medical officer moved among the survivors with slow, controlled steps, checking pulse monitors and oxygen feeds without removing control from the injured. They adjusted a regulator on a breathing mask with hands that shook only from exhaustion, not from uncertainty. They cleaned blood from a survivor's cheek with a cloth that smelled faintly of alcohol and recycled water. They tightened a blanket around shoulders that had forgotten warmth. Each action was small, nearly invisible against the vastness of the hall, yet each action carried a philosophy so heavy it bent the room around it. Responsibility did not mean deciding for someone. Responsibility meant staying with them while they decided. The court saw inefficiency. It saw wasted time, unnecessary strain, the reckless consumption of resources to preserve individuals who might still die anyway. Its metrics despised this kind of devotion. Under Union doctrine, it was irrational to spend effort on outcomes with low probability. Rational systems minimized loss by cutting away the weakest variables early. Humans did the opposite. They treated the weakest variables as vows. One survivor's vitals dropped suddenly, a sharp, alarming dip that made the nearest curator's protocols flare. The court's systems reacted instantly, offering automated stabilization and forced sedation. The medical officer moved faster than the machine could decide, pressing a manual injector against the survivor's arm, flooding the bloodstream with emergency support compounds. The survivor's breathing shuddered, caught, then steadied, each inhale scraping like sandpaper through damaged lungs. The court's sensors registered the change and attempted to label it a temporary correction. Yet the deeper anomaly remained. The human intervention had been chosen not because it was statistically elegant, but because it was morally necessary to those performing it. The archive attempted another approach. It ran simulations of human behavior under curator oversight, calculating compliance probabilities and failure points. It predicted that humans should eventually defer to the court once presented with enough evidence of suffering reduction. It projected that humans would accept the wisdom of minimizing pain and chaos. The simulations collapsed into contradiction after contradiction because the human variable was not pain tolerance. It was agency. The humans' actions were not the product of ignorance. They were the product of a species that had been burned by the idea of "for your own good" so many times it learned to flinch at kindness offered without permission. They had histories soaked in that phrase, carved into their collective memory like shrapnel. They had watched rulers, doctors, priests, and algorithms take choice away in the name of safety. They had learned the only reliable boundary in a universe full of excuses, the right to say yes and the right to say no. The court did not understand this boundary because it had never needed it. The court's authority had been accepted as absolute for so long that it forgot consent could exist without being granted. The judge's restraint fields tightened again, the harmonic hum rising into a pitch that made the air feel sharp. A judge signaled for the archive to escalate the classification process. New glyphs bloomed. Legal incapacity under catastrophic distress, curator designation pending, immediate removal recommended. The projections cast pale light across the survivors' faces, turning sweat into silver, turning bruises into dark constellations. The stamp hovered in the air, ready to fall. A human stepped forward and placed a gloved hand on the nearest survivor's shoulder, a small anchor against the court's gravity. Their grip was firm, not controlling, not possessive, but present. The survivor's tremor did not stop. The survivor did not become calm. The survivor did not become optimized, but the survivor remained upright, held in place not by force but by solidarity. The archive's systems hesitated. It hesitated because the survivor's stress reading was still too high, yet their decision-making signals, fragmented, wounded, furious with life, showed coherence. Not the clean coherence of a stable mind in a safe room, but the coherence of a being who knew exactly what they wanted, to be allowed to want anything at all. The court's doctrine said trauma made consent unreliable. Humanity demonstrated that trauma made consent more sacred because it was harder to hold on to. The curators attempted to enforce their protocol through a different channel. They transmitted authority verification pulses designed to compel cooperation from any registered delegation inside court space. The pulses rippled through the chamber as faint pressure waves, a sensation like a hand pressing against the skull from the inside. Most species folded under such signals. Their nervous systems responded with surrender reflexes, their muscles going slack, their minds drifting into compliance. The court considered this humane, a chemical shortcut that prevented panic. Humans resisted the pulse through sheer practiced stubbornness. Some winced. A few staggered half a step. One clenched their jaw so hard the muscles quivered along the throat. But they did not drop their tools. They did not release the survivors. They did not step aside and let someone else decide what happened next. Their bodies absorbed the pressure and returned it as stillness, an act of irrational defiance that made the court's systems register them as anomalous threats, despite the fact that they carried no weapons. Their weapon was refusal. The archive's projections, desperate to regain control, began comparing the survivors not to typical incapacitation cases, but to statistical outliers, individuals who survived events that should have killed them. It searched for a pattern, a reason, a solvable mechanism. The pattern it found was not biological. It was relational. The survivors did not persist because their species had stronger bones or superior organs. They persisted because humans had refused to stop carrying them. Because someone had stayed awake beside a failing life support panel for too long, hands bleeding from repairs, eyes burning from fatigue, heart hammering with terror. Because someone had rationed oxygen and food and warmth, choosing to suffer themselves so another could keep the right to choose. Because someone had looked at a dying person and decided that their will mattered even at the edge of oblivion. The court's data systems were not built to quantify that kind of responsibility. Their models had no variable for love that acted like a siege engine. The hall's air grew heavier as the court's own machinery strained. Ventilation systems adjusted to compensate for rising heat signatures. The archive's holograms flickered as processing demands escalated. The judges remained motionless, but the field readings around their plinths pulsed with increasing intensity, like a heartbeat accelerating in a body that had never needed one. In the midst of all that precision, the survivors stood unsteady and alive. They were not calm. They were not healed. They were not optimized. They did not fit the galaxy's preferred definition of acceptable existence. But they persisted anyway. And the humans, surrounded by the court's cold light and curator authority, made the most irrational decision in the universe look like the only sane one. They refused to take the survivor's choice away, even if it meant carrying them through pain, risk, and inefficiency until the court itself had no place left to hide its mercy. The translation lattice began to stutter the way a star stutters before it collapses, not with an explosion, but with a subtle wrongness that made the air feel thin. A clean stream of rendered language turned granular, syllables arriving out of sequence, pauses forming where no pauses belonged. The court's ceiling emitters flickered with a faint tremor as the system recalibrated itself, seeking stability in the face of something it had never been designed to carry. Emotion, not the gentle, regulated effect that diplomatic algorithms expected. Not the controlled grief of ceremonial species who mourned with ritual precision. This was raw output from bodies that had been close enough to death to smell it, survivors forcing meaning through broken lungs and shaking hands. The testimonies did not come as elegant statements. They came as fragments torn loose from memory, coated in fear and salt and frost. The lattice took the first statements without complaint. It translated the biological facts easily. Oxygen deprivation, structural collapse, nutritional failure, vacuum exposure, containment breach. It rendered the conditions into neat terminology the court could archive. Those parts sat cleanly inside the system's comfort zone, because data was what the court had always eaten. Then the survivors began to describe what had been taken. The words did not fit. The translation lattice attempted equivalence and found none. It reached into its lexicon, pulled out terms like harm reduction and compassionate action and protective authority, but the survivors' intent scraped against those phrases like rusted metal. The system tried again, swapping synonyms, compressing meaning into safer structures, trimming away the emotional excess as if it were static. The output only became worse. A survivor's statement entered the lattice with a trembling cadence, breath catching on pain, and the translator returned a line of language that fractured mid-sentence. Another survivor's testimony described the moment a curator arrived, and the lattice misfired, translating choice into procedure, then correcting itself repeatedly, oscillating as if the concept were an unstable particle. The pauses grew longer. The rendered words arrived with irregular spacing. The tone filters began to fail, unable to decide whether the sound in the survivor's throat was anger, grief, terror, or something beyond classification. The hall of verdicts filled with that stuttering output, and it felt like hearing the universe itself hesitate. The court registered the first warning in its own internal diagnostics. Emotional saturation levels exceeded calibrated thresholds. The risk of cognitive contamination rose. The probability of procedural instability climbed. The court's systems proposed intervention, sedation of the witnesses, removal of the unstable elements, restoration of clean communication channels. The judges did not order it. They did not understand why they did not order it. Their restraint fields hummed, their bodies motionless, their minds connected to the archive's vast predictive engines. Every model insisted that allowing unregulated testimony was dangerous. Every precedent demanded immediate containment. And yet the command did not come, as if an unseen hand had pressed against the court's own authority and held it still. A hesitation, the first in its existence. It appeared not as a grand declaration, but as a delay measured in heartbeats and processing cycles. A fraction of time where the court simply watched instead of acting. In that delay, the survivors continued. A human technician shifted the translation lattice's auxiliary inputs, feeding it raw audio without the usual smoothing filters. The change was brutal. The hall received the testimonies with all their ragged edges intact. The wet click of saliva in a dry mouth, the rasp of scar tissue, the tremor that broke words into shards. The sound carried weight that no polished language could hide. It crawled into the court's sterile geometry and left stains that no cleansing protocol could remove. The archive responded by projecting survival curves across the chamber, luminous ribbons of probability that arced over the survivors like cold halos. Each curve showed what the court had always shown: predicted outcomes if curators acted, predicted outcomes if they did not. The lines were elegant, and their elegance was its own kind of cruelty. The curves bent toward minimized suffering. The curves bent toward quiet endings. The curves bent toward decisions made without asking. Then the human delegation introduced a variable the court had never quantified: responsibility that refused to end when efficiency demanded it. They did not present legal constructs. They presented continuity footage, sensor records, and physiological timelines collected during disasters the court had already closed. The images were not clean. They were grainy, shaking, full of harsh glare and deep shadow. They showed cramped corridors lit by emergency strips, frost blooming across bulkheads, hands bleeding against broken panels. They showed humans forcing air through failing scrubbers and sharing masks between breaths. They showed exhausted eyes watching monitors with the kind of devotion usually reserved for prayers. The court had archived these incidents as resolved cases. The curators had written final reports. The seals had been stamped. The survivors should have been minimized into silence. But here they were, alive, because humans had refused to comply. The translation lattice tried to render the human actions into familiar moral language. It failed. It could not fit dragging a stranger through vacuum death corridors into risk mitigation. It could not reduce staying awake until hallucinations bled into reality, into procedural compliance. It could not translate "we did not decide for them" into any category the court respected, because the court's entire system was built on deciding for others. The emotional saturation rose again, and this time it bled into the archive itself. Projections began to shift in ways that did not match their own templates. Survival curves adjusted. Not upward in efficiency, not toward greater statistical preservation, but toward something that made the judge's restraint fields vibrate with discomfort, meaning. A curve that ended in fewer lives saved remained optimal by some calculations. Yet the same curve now carried a different shadow, a non-mathematical cost that the archive could not remove. The loss was no longer just bodies. It was theft. The court could calculate reduced suffering. It could not calculate stolen choice. That concept struck its systems like debris punching through a hull. The archive tried to run compensation models, attempting to translate lack of consent into a numeric penalty. It attempted to assign values, psychological impact, long-term instability, cultural trauma. It projected a range of probable consequences. The models collapsed. The data refused to stabilize because choice was not a commodity. It was not a resource. It was not an outcome. It was the boundary that separated mercy from atrocity, and boundaries could not be averaged. The judges watched the archive struggle, and something in the court's perfect silence began to rot. In the upper plinths, the restraint fields around certain judges emitted micro-oscillations, almost imperceptible shifts that indicated internal conflict. The court's internal monitoring flagged it as anomaly, involuntary hesitation response. It treated the judges like it treated the survivors, measuring their instability, preparing containment recommendations. For the first time, the system could not decide who was unstable. Curators stood at the edges of the hall, white suits reflecting the flickering projections. Their authority protocols continued to pulse softly, like a heartbeat that refused to stop even when the body began to fail. Their hands remained steady. Their posture remained perfect. But their internal telemetry showed a change, latency. They were waiting for commands that did not arrive. They were forced, by the court's hesitation, to do something they had never been trained to do. They were forced to witness. The survivors' testimonies continued to feed the translation lattice, and the lattice continued to falter. Its error rates climbed until the system began outputting partial translations layered with unresolved fragments. Words arrived with gaps like missing teeth. The pauses grew so long that the hall's silence poured into them like water into cracks. The court's sensory dampeners could not erase the effect. Those pauses felt louder than any sound. They felt like the space where consent should have been asked. A survivor's oxygen feed alarm chirped softly, the sound small and desperate. A human medic silenced it with a quick adjustment, fingers moving with practiced gentleness. The survivor's eyes closed for a moment, then opened again, still refusing to disappear. Their chest rose, fell, rose again. Alive not because they were optimized, but because someone had decided their will was worth the cost. The archive's projections began cross-referencing older cases at an escalating rate, pulling up records of entire populations labeled incapacitated during disaster. The holograms filled with names that had never been spoken in the hall. Whole ships whose crews had been resolved, without their understanding. Colonies whose last moments had been sleep-induced by curators who believed they were doing good. Rescue opportunities never pursued because the models said the effort would be inefficient. The court had never needed to look back. Its authority depended on never looking back. Now the data forced it to stare into its own reflection. The translation lattice failed again, not with a crash, but with an audible mechanical shiver that traveled through the emitters like a sigh. A thin stream of sparks fluttered from a ceiling node, quickly swallowed by emergency suppression foam that smelled faintly of chemical snow. The court's systems rerouted translation through secondary cores, but the stutter returned immediately, as if the concept trying to pass through the machine was too heavy for its structure. No amount of calibration could lighten it. The judges sat suspended in their perfect geometry, surrounded by the evidence of living defiance, and the most terrifying change in the universe took place. The court began to understand. Not fully, not comfortably. Understanding did not arrive as a clean conclusion. It arrived like nausea, like pressure in the skull, like the slow realization that a lifetime of mercy might have been built on a silent crime. The archive's light dimmed, then brightened, then dimmed again, unable to settle. The survival curves hovered uncertainly above the survivors, their endpoints shimmering, their certainty dissolving into something fragile. In the Hall of Verdicts, the court's hesitation deepened, and the galaxy's oldest machine of compassion began to break, not from sabotage, not from war, but from the unbearable realization that it had been saving lives by stealing the right to live them. A single command line appeared in the Continuance archive, bright as a vein of lightning across a storm-dark sky, and then it stopped. Not completed, not approved, not rejected. It simply hung there, unfinished, an instruction waiting for the force of certainty to push it into reality. That force never came. The Hall of Verdicts remained suspended in its sterile cold, but the machinery behind its calm began to falter in ways no sabotage could have achieved. The court's automated authority, the invisible hand that had always reached down to seal choices shut, hesitated long enough to become something else entirely: restraint. Vent ports that should have opened stayed closed. Containment fields that should have snapped into place remained dormant. Curator command channels, usually a constant pulse of affirmation, fell into a quiet so deep it felt like pressure against the skin. The judges did not announce a ruling. They could not. There was no ceremonial motion, no official decree carved into luminous record stone, no triumphant statement of law. The court had built itself to end uncertainty, and now uncertainty lived inside it like a slow infection. A verdict required confidence. Confidence required the old doctrine. The old doctrine had been punctured by a truth too simple to argue with. A living being had looked up at the court and refused to be saved by being erased. So the decision emerged the only way it could, in silence. The archive dimmed its projections until the hall was no longer flooded with probability halos. The survival curves dissolved, their endpoints fading like smoke pulled into a vacuum vent. Trauma indices and incapacity glyphs evaporated one by one, and the air seemed to inhale for the first time in centuries. The court's restraint fields loosened in tiny increments, harmonic pressure easing off the chamber like a fist unclenching. Even the dying star's light outside, filtered through the court's facets, seemed to warm by a degree, as though the universe itself noticed the change and dared to breathe. Curators stood motionless, their white suits suddenly looking less like guardians and more like relics. Their authority implants continued to seek commands, sending silent pings into networks that had always answered. The answers did not come. Instead, a recall signal began to crawl through the court's infrastructure, slow and deliberate, carried on channels that had once distributed orders of quiet termination. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived like a pulse in a corpse that had not yet admitted it was dead. Across Union space, curators received the recall in the middle of their work. On plague stations where containment doors had already sealed, the curators paused with their hands on access panels and felt their authority evaporate. In disaster camps where populations trembled behind ration fences, the curators stopped issuing directives and watched their own systems flicker into neutral. On drifting ships, where automated sedation mists had been prepped to quiet panic, the canisters remained locked. The recall spread through every sector where mercy had once arrived as an irreversible decision. And wherever the recall landed, silence followed. Protocols froze. Not erased, not condemned, simply halted as if a massive hand had reached into the machinery of civilization and turned the power down. Classification systems that had once labeled dissent as instability began to produce blank outputs. The legal phrase, incapacitated under extreme distress, remained in the lexicon, but its execution routine returned errors. The court's authority had not been defeated. It had been suspended, and the difference was the sound of chains unlocking instead of snapping. In the Hall of Verdicts, the human delegation did not celebrate. Their faces remained carved in exhaustion and stubborn restraint. Their posture did not soften into relief, because humans had learned not to trust sudden kindness from systems that had once tried to end them gently. They stayed near the survivors, hands still on support frames and pod rails, as if the mere act of proximity could keep the court from reverting to habit. Their medics continued to monitor oxygen feeds. Their technicians kept override plates in place. Their eyes remained vigilant, scanning judges and curators alike, because this was not a battlefield victory. It was a moral turning point, and those were always more fragile than war. The survivors stayed upright in the court's cold light, trembling and breathing like damaged engines kept running by sheer will. Some leaned into their braces. Some blinked slowly as if the brightness hurt. Their bodies still screamed through metrics the court had once used as justification for removal. Their minds still carried trauma that would take lifetimes to heal. Yet they remained, and the court, for the first time, did not punish them for being unstable. The translation lattice, still stuttering, attempted to render the weight of what had happened into terms that could be transmitted. It tried to find a phrase for the court's new behavior. It searched the catalog of legal outcomes, but found no match. The closest it could assemble was incomplete, suspension of automated authority pending revision. The output looked pale and fragile against the archive's vast emptiness. It was enough. The signal left the court on open union channels, a quiet transmission that spread like frost in reverse, thawing things that had been locked down for ages. Member species heard it and felt something strange inside their cultural bones: doubt. Some had built their entire sense of safety on curator mercy. Some had lost ancestors to humane resolution and accepted it as the cost of civilization. Some had never questioned it because questioning it felt like challenging gravity. Now gravity itself was trembling. Emergency councils assembled in orbital chambers and undersea domes and hive cities carved into moons. Leaders stared at the transmission as if it were blasphemy. Legal intelligences spun up analysis loops that ran until heat bloomed in their cores. Philosophers who had spent lifetimes preaching compassionate authority found their tongues heavy with ash. Younger species, those closer to survival and still haunted by memories of being powerless, watched the silence from the court and felt something like vindication rising in their throats. None of them received a neat explanation. There was no official narrative to cling to, no announcement to paraphrase into propaganda. There was only the absence of a command that had always come. There was only the sudden permission to ask what had previously been forbidden. Who decided? Who asked? Who assumed? In the wake of the court's silence, curators returned to their home worlds and sealed their insignias away in vaults. Their authority codes were deprecated, not with ceremony, but with deliberate neglect, as if civilization had suddenly realized it had been carrying a loaded weapon in its pocket and wanted to forget the weight of it. In legal archives, case files that had been marked closed were reopened. Not to change the past, because the past was a corpse that could not be revived, but to admit what those files truly contained. Not mercy, convenience. In the court itself, the judges remained suspended, their bodies still, their restraint fields flickering with irregular rhythm. The court's internal monitoring continued to track them, feeding their biosignatures into its own algorithms. It flagged the court's collective state as unstable, and for a moment the irony cut through the chamber like a blade. By its own doctrine, the court should have been declared incapacitated, its authority removed, a curator assigned to decide for it. But there was no curator left to assign. The machine of compassion had broken its own teeth on the concept of consent. Classification systems began to rewrite themselves. Terms that had once carried the weight of certainty were amended with new clauses that stung like exposed nerves. Under extreme distress, agency is presumed intact. Under catastrophic conditions, consent must be sought. Under imminent death, choice remains personal. The old doctrine did not vanish overnight. It bled out slowly, dragged down by the sheer mass of its own contradictions. There were protests on worlds that had trusted the curators. There were riots in sectors where populations believed the court had just removed the galaxy's safety net. There were whispered confessions in private chambers where leaders admitted they had relied on imposed mercy because it spared them the burden of asking. And threaded through all of it was a new phrase that spread without permission, carved into data streams, and spoken in trembling broadcasts, a phrase that did not sound like law. Consent is not comfort. Consent is a boundary. Humans did not conquer the court with warships or technological superiority. They did not storm the plinths. They did not burn archives or execute judges. They shattered the court by refusing to let suffering be used as an excuse to steal agency. They forced the galaxy to stare at the line it had blurred for ages, the line between salvation and atrocity, and they refused to let anyone pretend it was complicated. In the Hall of Verdicts, the survivors were escorted out not by curators, but by human hands and human caution. The docking corridors smelled less sterile now, tainted by sweat and disinfectant and the stubborn warmth of living bodies passing through. The court's doors did not seal behind them with finality. They simply closed, as if even the architecture had learned to stop pretending it could end a story with a click. Outside, the dying star continued to burn down towards silence, shedding its last colors across the court's black facets. The court remained in orbit, ancient and quiet, no longer a blade disguised as mercy, but a monument to the moment the galaxy remembered something it should never have forgotten. Choice was not a variable to be optimized. Choice was the difference between a hand reaching to save and a hand closing a throat while calling it kindness.